last panel. So the stage is about to be refurbished into a party area after this, so stay tuned for our final panel. This time it's about privacy. Who all is affected by that? Okay, not so many. The other lives in public, right? Yeah, my sister's actually a privacy lawyer by trade, so I'm very interested in what you're about to tell us. Please appear on stage. Big applause, please, for our final panel this time around on this stage. Kind of the closing party of the official parts, so please appear here. Big round. Thank you. So enjoy. There will be a Q&A, sorry. There will be a Q&A, so please be prepared to ask questions if you want to, of course, nobody's forced, and enjoy.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and hi everyone. Glad that you're still here, although it's getting later afternoon. My name is Johannes. I'm a postdoc at the University of Luxembourg, and so I'm working on blockchain and digital identity related topics. And I'm very honored that today we have like two people as speakers who are very well known in the field of privacy. And so we'll try to have a hopefully also controversial discussion about what is the best approach to achieve privacy. And so I think we have in mind with this like traditional Web 2 payments, but also blockchain-based payment solutions, maybe digital identity solutions. And I hope that we will also have some time for Q&A in the very end. So with this, I would like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. And so maybe we'll start with Daira-Emma. Maybe you can also present a little bit what projects you've worked on in the past and also what your definition of privacy is, because this is actually a quite contested term.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, the lights are phasing me a little bit, but I'll get used to them. My name's Daira-Emma. Daira-Emma Hopwood. I've designed various protocols or co-designed them. Zcash, Sphinx, which is a post-quantum hash-based signature scheme. Various other cryptography sort of libraries that I've worked on. Tahoe LAFS, which is a distributed file store. And I basically got into cryptography and cryptocurrency through politics because I really, really care about privacy. I think it's an absolutely essential part of human freedom. And in the 90s, the UK government was proposing basically that the government would have access to everyone's keys. And I didn't find that acceptable. Many, many people didn't find that acceptable. And we defeated that proposal. Well, I think some of that actual proposal has come back recently. But at the time, we delayed what would have been quite a dystopian development. So I guess that's my background. I'm also a trans and disabled activist in Manchester, organised the last two trans prides in Manchester.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, my name is Nico. I'm one of the, I work on Archium, which is a confidential compute network on Solana, but also generally speaking for chains, which basically allows you to do computations directly on encrypted data without ever needing to decrypt it. Before that, I built Elusive, which was at the time on Solana the largest private payment solution. So it was a little bit similar, used similar tech as Zcash did, for example. For basically allowing for private payments directly on Solana. And prior to that, I worked with TEs a little bit. Was over on the dark side of cryptography and privacy tooling back then. But so I've tried a little bit of everything. But obviously, just like Daira, do also believe that privacy is super important, just for ensuring freedom of expression, generally speaking, in a society. I don't really think that's possible if you don't have privacy in place, just because as soon as you're going to express a completely new or disruptive idea, you will probably get shut down unless you have some form of privacy to allow that to flourish a little bit into something bigger. And although, generally speaking, not all new disruptive ideas are necessarily good, I do think more of them are good than are bad. And without privacy, we can't really have that at all. So yeah, I think it's a very important topic.
Okay. Maybe a brief question for the audience. So who of you is familiar with zero-knowledge proofs, multi-party computation, TEs? Is this something we should introduce, or can we base our discussion on this? So who is familiar with it? Okay, I guess that's most of the audience, so we will skip an introduction on that. Okay, so maybe to go a step back. So how would you define privacy, and where is it under attack today, or why do we need better solutions than what we have in place? I think, Daira-Emma, you already went into end-to-end encryption when you're talking about keys. Can you shed some detail on that? So what is privacy from your perspective, and where is it under threat?
Privacy is, okay, so I'll basically repeat an argument that I made recently in a video for Electric Coin Company, and this was posted on Twitter, and there's a whole story about how it got mostly transphobic comments. But in any case, the argument was this: you have privacy for your own thoughts. You can reason about the world. You can decide how you think the world should be in some aspect. And then the next step is to discuss that with your friends, because you could be wrong. You might not have thought of perspectives that they have. But if you can't do that privately, then you're always going to be concerned that that discussion could come back to haunt you, that you might be discussing very controversial ideas. You need that freedom of expression, and you need it at kind of every sort of level of scope of interaction between humans. You need it in a one-to-one chat. You need it in sort of a group of friends, a group of peers in a company. You need it with your medical provider. You need it in your financial transactions, and I'll talk more about that. You need it at every level. And some of our communication systems don't work very well at scaling in that sense. So you might be on sort of some one-to-one chat, and sort of, or the reverse, you might be in some group chat and then go one-to-one with a specific person. Does that preserve the privacy properties? Does that so still defend adequately against even very powerful adversaries?
Okay, and so from what I understand, basically, I mean, the origin of the word privacy, as far as I'm aware, comes from the right to be left alone. So it's basically this, and also that you basically need to actively consent to information disclosure about yourself with respect to any third party. Is this about right?
Consent is a huge part of it, yeah. I think of privacy as kind of intertwined with a whole set of other properties. So we can think about sort of freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of political speech, bodily autonomy, so protecting information about who you're talking to, your networks, your financial privacy, your location privacy. So for example, we might think that some transactions, financial transactions, are not very important. But if you're buying something like a cup of coffee that you're consuming in a particular location, then that your location privacy is dependent on your financial privacy. And so all of these properties are interdependent. And I actually encourage you to sort of write down these things and think about the relations between them and how compromising one of them can compromise the others.
Thank you. Okay. But does this definition of privacy resonate with you? And why do you think is on-chain privacy maybe more important important or more difficult to achieve than, for example, also end-to-end encryption when it comes to technology?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that definition of privacy. But regarding on-chain privacy, I think up until very recently, on-chain privacy wasn't that much of something that was heard of, which I think was for two main reasons. The first one is that when you look at blockchains, like you sort of have two groups of people that are interested in them. One of them is extremely technical, and the other almost the opposite, very, very little technical. And so that means when you looked at the initial like chains that came out, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, that type of stuff, if you show that to a layperson and they might look on use a block explorer and look at their transaction, upon first glance they might think, oh, this is private by default anyway, because they just see a couple of hexadecimal characters and might not necessarily be able to decode that there's actual transparent information going through. And
somewhere they may have read that like digital signatures have to do with encryption in a certain sense and misunderstand. Yeah.
Precisely though. Yeah. Like I it sounds stupid to some extent, but like I think this is something that especially technical people overlook at many points. Just because if you're technical, you're like, well, of course most blockchains are completely transparent. Everyone knows that, but most people don't necessarily know that or aren't necessarily aware of it when using blockchains, or at least not to the degree of which they're transparent. And the second part is that Bitcoin, for example, when it was invented, or Ethereum, they didn't make their chains fully transparent because they didn't know about privacy or because they didn't think of it, it didn't occur to them. It's also just because I'm sure Daira knows this just as well as me. Building privacy in ideally fully decentralized systems is very hard. Just because especially 20 years ago, a lot of the primitives that we use today to achieve these, like zero knowledge proofs and multi-party computation tech and fully homomorphic encryption, like these three have made tons of progress over the last decade or two. And before that, were mostly just mentioned in scientific papers, but didn't really have much real-life applicability. However, I do think that the progress that we've seen over the past couple of years, especially with regards to ZK, about how much progress has gone there to make it more efficient, more usable, and whatnot, really promises a very nice future for this type of tech.
I agree completely. There's a very wide range of sort of depth of technical background, ranging from pretty much none to experts using cryptocurrencies. I want to delve into some of the detail of what I think a financial, a private payment protocol, say, needs in order to be considered private as a baseline. So there's a lot of information that that an adversary could obtain by combining information from different sources. An adversary is not restricted to passively looking at the blockchain and inferring information from it. They can participate in transactions. And so they, for example, if they have a hypothesis about an address that belongs to some suspect in an investigation, say, then, and I'm using law enforcement terms there, but that could easily just be a criminal gang who wants to find out who's ratted on them. It's the same problem. You can't distinguish those two cases. And so in order for a financial transfer protocol to be adequately private, in my view, it needs to hide the whole transaction graph. So the transaction graph, can I have a show of hands of who sort of basically knows what UTXO-based blockchain protocols are? Yeah, I think we could probably assume that as background, and you can go and look it up if you don't know it. But the transaction graph is kind of the graph of and graph in the mathematical sense of sort of a linkage between different nodes. And what you're hiding is that graph of so what input relates to what output. And that's basically all of the information that is on chain. There are also amounts and addresses and so on. So if all of that information is hidden, then you have an adequate financial privacy protocol. So it's not sufficient, for example, to say that an input could correspond to one of only a small number of outputs. So if you look at a protocol like Monero before full chain membership proofs, then there are lots of attacks on it. But basically, full chain membership proofs solved that. And I'm not sure exactly what stage they're up to in implementing that, but that requires zero knowledge proofs. It's essentially, it's very similar protocol to Zcash and Zero Cash. And so this is what a blockchain protocol that actually wants to be private needs to achieve. And if the protocol is programmable as well, then there are additional requirements.
So we're seeing like an increasing number of, I think, implementations that consider privacy. Like, I mean, we also have Tornado Cash and Railgun, for example, on Ethereum that are going into a very similar direction as Zcash. So Nico, who is responsible for making this accessible at a large scale? Because I feel like that still a lot of solutions, also solutions which like zero knowledge proofs alone cannot solve, like, for example, Uniswap. Who is responsible for maintaining privacy or improving privacy there? Because right now, nobody seems to be responsible or feel responsible.
Well, I mean, to some extent, I think all layers, like if you consider the stack of, interaction on-chain, for example, or off-chain as well, I feel like there's three like core members. You have the infrastructure providers at the bottom. In the on-chain case, this might be, the blockchain itself that you're building on top. Then you have some application, ideally built on top of it. And then finally, you have the user actually interacting with that application. And so this actually kind of touches upon what you mentioned earlier, which is that I think essentially, if you want to have a private system such as Zcash or how many of these systems work, generally speaking, in order to, if your goal is to hide the transaction graph, it works better if you have more people actually using it. And I think to have more people actually using it isn't just a case of saying, okay, we have great cryptography and we have great privacy guarantees and whatnot, but I do think programmability, even though you just quickly touched upon at the end, is extremely important. Just because if you look at blockchains that are the most popular today, stuff like Ethereum, Base, Solana, things like this, they all have in common that they are very programmable and very easy to build on. And that's just because most people today, when they're using blockchain applications, don't necessarily just want to send money to their friend or receive money, but they want to use decentralized exchanges, do lending, do a million other things. And so I think to get back to your initial question of who's responsible for that, I think at the very bottom layer, infrastructure is responsible in terms of course, providing solid cryptographic primitives and having a battle-tested implementation, but also in terms of building infrastructure that allows a variety of applications to live on top of it instead of, just sending, for example. Application developers, of course, are responsible as well in actually using those primitives correctly, logically, and wrapping them in a nice package for users to interact with. And finally, users, of course, need to be careful about not sending their private key to someone on Discord or something like this. But I think at the base layer, the biggest responsibility in this case falls to the actual infrastructure providers at the very bottom to build tooling that is not just secure, but actually usable for many use cases.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's part of the reason that this has taken so long is that it's really hard to do. The combination of privacy, scalability, and programmability is incredibly hard to do in the sense that it's still an unsolved research problem in my mind. And I think that combination is possible. It's it's not an example of a trilemma where you can only have two of the three. It's just really, really hard with many, many opportunities for mistakes. And we have to think about not just mistakes in the base layer protocol, the L1 and or as I call it, the L0, which is the consensus layer proper in the distributed system sense, and the L1, which is the open economic computation that you're trying to implement, but also the primitives that are available to build smart contracts need to actually be usable, understandable, coherent, analyzable, and I don't think that, for example, Solidity does that.
So I found the aspect of basically herd privacy very important. So without a large number of users, privacy guarantees usually diminish, at least like in payments where you can watch timestamps, for instance, of transactions occurring, and maybe you have a CCTV somewhere and you can infer something. So from my perspective, what would be interesting, so if we want to have large-scale adoption of privacy by design solutions, is it really promising to go the way of, say, systems that are a side of regulation and today not really covered by regulation or even actively opposed, as we've seen for Tornado Cash and also Zcash to some extent? Or given that we have programmability, wouldn't it also be appealing to try to integrate some of the most important compliance requirements that also would give the regulator an easier time accepting it and therefore also facilitating large-scale adoption, which is today also inhibited by regulators putting pressure on individuals who want private payments, for instance?
It's an unproven proposition that any compliance mechanism that researchers come up with or practitioners come up with would actually be accepted by a regulator.
I agree, but they are discussing it at least. Yeah.
There's a long history of academics proposing protocols that, in my opinion, actually compromise far too much and defeat the goals that we're trying to achieve. I think we need to push back against the idea that financial privacy protocols need compliance in the same way that we did for communication protocols. And I know that battle for private communication is not won yet, but we're further along in that field. We have the ubiquitous use of HTTPS now. And so we are not just using communications cryptography for things like sending your credit card info, as we were in the 90s. We're using them routinely. And we also need to have financial privacy protocols that are used routinely, including for transactions that people don't think of as very important. They may be low value. People don't care about them inherently as revealing a large amount of information about themselves, although there is that issue of location privacy that I mentioned earlier. But they're needed to be private so that so this argument about the anonymity set, about hiding the important transactions within a much larger set of indistinguishable transactions, that is needed in practice to get the privacy properties that we want.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with this. One other thing I'd like to add on top of that, though, is like getting back to what I mentioned before about differentiating between like privacy tech at the base infrastructure layer and privacy tech at the application layer. And I'm 100% on the side that, privacy tech at the base layer, really where it's, not necessarily meant to be as much used by an end user, but just meant to be used as a basic primitive or basic protocol which other applications can build on top, should never be in such a state that we compromise with, with privacy by entering backdoors or any other stuff like that. Just because if you look at, communication technology and protocols that are used there, like standard stuff like AES or SSL, things like this. None of these have backdoors in them, except in certain regimes where it's enforced that such protocols are not allowed to be used or have to be implemented in a specific way so that certain actors can have a look at private information that's being transferred. And if we sort of compare regimes where such protocols are enforced, whereas regimes whereby we say we want to have fully private base layer protocols, and applications on top of that can do with regulation what they choose. Generally speaking, the latter leads to a lot more free society and, in my opinion, a lot better society for everyone to live in.
So, for society, also topics like money laundering, terrorist financing, I would say do play a role. So society not only suffers from bad privacy, it also suffers from tax evasion, money laundering, all those things. Don't you think that there should be some balance also, particularly if it's implementable, like for example, threshold-based private payments, so you can do certain amounts in a private way and then higher amounts in a transparent way? Don't you think that, like, for overall good, we need to find some sweet spot between those two?
I'm going to push back on the premise of the question. We've had banks, centralized finance facilitating money laundering. We've had governments sending money to terrorists. We have governments being terrorists.
But they were discovered.
Some of them have been discovered. I think that it's difficult to argue that as sort of law enforcement people tend to do, that they're finding all of the criminals and they need to prevent cryptography from being used in order to continue finding all of the criminals. They're not. Criminals will have privacy because they have incentives to spend a lot of resources on it, and they're in some sense, from their point of view, they're allowed to do things that so we are not, because most of us, we either want to follow the law, or in certain cases where we think that a law is unjust, we want to break it. But we're not thinking of that as a criminal action. And I'm not sure that it's feasible to do what the governments sort of pretend they're able to do and kind of claim that they're eliminating some category of crime like money laundering or terrorist financing. They're not even trying in a lot of cases because they're part of it. So I think that, so to complete that argument, if criminals are going to have privacy anyway, we should have privacy. If governments are going to have privacy in their own internal communications, we should have privacy. And we don't need to compromise on that.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. You mentioned before about finding some sweet spot where we can, stop the criminals, but also not get governmental oppression. I mean, if, in an ideal world, if such a scheme existed or such a setup existed, I would go for that 100%. But like the way I see it, it's like, it's not 100% binary, but for the most part it is. It's basically, we allow privacy, and even if we don't, as Daira mentioned, most likely criminals will have it anyway. But if we don't, you basically don't not just have the problem of saying, oh, criminals are using it for bad, but rather you even have the problem of saying, if we get a bit unlucky with who gets in charge of our government, suddenly we have literally zero way of defending against that, especially in today's digital age where you could, in theory, surveil people better than at any time in history, especially if no cryptography tooling exists that can defend against that. And defending against criminals obviously is not a nice thing to do, but it's something that is to some extent manageable, at least in most countries of the world. But fighting against a totalitarian state that can listen to you at any private conversation, no matter where you are, I don't think you're going to win that. So for that reason, I think having cryptography and maintaining it is super important.
It's important to recognize that some of the worst abuses of surveillance in human history, I'm thinking of things like the co-option of citizens in East Germany by the Stasi to inform on their neighbors. That kind of thing is still happening. It's still happening in the US because there are laws in, for example, Florida, where I think it's Florida, it might be Alabama, some of those states, where private citizens are incentivized to report on people who are seeking an abortion. So we are not in a state where we have just liberal democracies who can be trusted. We are not in a state where we are not at severe risk of fascist governments being elected. We are in danger, and we need to do something about it, and part of what we need to do is not compromising on privacy.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, this is also what you're doing, right? You're implementing solutions that have effective means of evading also censorship, and that allow citizens to opt out of the current system and opt into a system that may have a tension with the current regulatory regime, but if they maintain best practices, at least they won't be caught with high probability. But still we are seeing...
Well, they may be, but they're at least trying.
Yeah, they're trying, yeah. So I strongly agree with the point that like a fallback option in case a system that is maybe also compliant is getting worse is a very good thing to have as a backup. The question is, does this system also have the opportunity to grow as much as we would like to? Or wouldn't it make sense to also try to have a system? I mean, not all the systems that are compliant are necessarily compromising on privacy in every dimension. So if you consider cash, for instance, right? I mean, we're still allowed to use cash in most of the transactions, not necessarily all of them. Some countries you can't buy real estate, some countries you can. But there are typically threshold-based approaches where you can say, okay, anything up to 10,000 euros, you're allowed to pay in cash with like very good privacy guarantees because this is not being tracked. And anything that goes beyond this threshold, there is a societal reason why we would maybe want to record this. Wouldn't that also be implementable with zero-knowledge proofs or other programmable cryptocurrency in a digital way, such that you prove, for example, that a certain digital ID, which is a public key, has not used more than a certain budget of private transactions in this month and therefore is allowed to do that. So I think that's possible. Where are the threats of this approach?
So I think it's very fragile to rely on good faith in those limits being maintained at reasonable values. If you look at the example of India, they suddenly basically outlawed banknotes above sort of a reasonably low level, such that it affected. It wasn't just affecting people who were doing money laundering, or it affected the whole population, and our political systems are not stable enough that we can rely on that kind of sort of fuzzy boundary between what's enforced and what's not. And if we build that kind of thing into code, it's a one-line change to go from something that seems reasonable to something that's completely dystopian.
So you would be afraid that basically people are lured into the compliance solution, and then even if there exists an opt-out, that this opt-out would basically cease to be relevant because all of the people have been drawn into the compliance solution, which then if it is changed, basically you have lost the opportunity to opt out. Is that like?
I mean, to put it in very practical terms, I'm not going to participate in designing such systems. I'm not going to give my expertise and brainpower into building systems like that, because I think they are too easily co-opted and subverted. And I have concretely refused to do that in a couple of cases.
So are you optimistic that blockchain-based solutions that are not necessarily created or approved by the regulator will gain substantial traction in the next decade?
I mean, for myself, like with Argument we're building, I think with Argument we're building an interesting case because we're building something where you can essentially have it both ways to some extent. And that sounds weird after what I said previously, but let me elaborate a little bit. Because for example, if you look at basic cryptographic primitives like basic encryption algorithms or key exchange algorithms or something like that, those are tolerated by governments because most applications that use them have some other form of compliance built in. For example, if you look at stuff like secure messaging, you have things like Signal, but most people use stuff like WhatsApp or whatnot. And although those are, they say they are end-to-end encrypted and whatnot, at the end of the day, it's closed source and it's meta, so who knows? But the main idea behind Argument is that we basically say we build the base layer for this type of stuff, where we say we build infrastructure on which anyone can build encrypted applications in general. And then it's up to the person actually building the encrypted application to decide if they want to say, do we want to go the WhatsApp route and build, some encrypted exchange whereby under certain conditions, certain stuff gets revealed, or do we want to build an encrypted exchange where, nothing ever gets revealed, anything in that direction. So honestly, I'm not 100% sure what the future of that holds, whether that type of thing has a future or not. But I do know that privacy has a future either way, whether that be with some compliance in place or not. So that's why I'm excited about building Argument specifically.
I mean, so if we're comparing to communication protocols, I always advise that people use Signal, because the mental model for what privacy you're getting is a lot clearer. All chats are encrypted. It doesn't matter how many people are in the chat. The disappearing messages feature works. I'm not sort of having to think all of the time about, is this, I'm using an encrypted messenger app, is this really encrypted? And by the way, I'm not saying that Zcash does this perfectly, because Zcash has transparent addresses and transactions. Zcash doesn't satisfy the property that I'm talking about here. But I think that sort of having really strong privacy properties that are easier for the users of the system to reason about is a huge win. And compliance, compliance protocols, I always put it in inverted commas, they erode that. The mental model is too complicated.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we have time for one or maybe even two questions.
And thanks for that panel. Final chance to ask a question during this conference. Otherwise, you have to wait for a year, I believe. You are. Thanks. Thanks for that. Good job.
But while the microphone is being handed out, I realized there was something I really wanted to talk about, and that's insider attacks. So we need to be sort of a lot more careful and thorough and diligent in treating basically everything involved with a protocol as a potential adversary or involved in a potential attack. And we're not doing that well enough at the moment, so we need to improve.
If there's no question, I think that was a very decent final remark. Last chance. Nope. Okay. You have the subscription, huh?
So I see the moderator has been talking a lot for the regulation side of it, and how do you see the speaker about different regulation, different regime, Europe, US, Russia, China, and how do you see this different kind of regime actually? Is there any arbitrage happening or game theory happening on this level?
Do you want to answer that first?
I didn't quite get the question.
So these proposals for regulation are hundreds of pages, and I'm writing code and specs all day. I have to rely on other people to interpret them for me. So I'm not in a position to compare, for example, the EU and US proposals. So I don't know the answer to that question.
So let's thank the wonderful speakers.
Yeah,
And
thanks for that panel.
And I guess we'll also stay around a little bit for questions after the closing, maybe?
Yes, also please don't run away. This concluded our semi-official parts, but we still have the closing ceremony and the after party and lots of things to come. So stay tuned for a couple minutes. We'll rearrange things and then get going.
But actually, so if you want to know about that, then Coin Center is they're good people to ask because they do that all day.
Cool. Then stay tuned. Big applause for our panel, please.